It is 445 million years ago, and you are standing on the deck of a research ship sailing across the ancient Paleotethys Ocean. It is the late Ordovician period of Earth's history, and the Earth is in the middle of a climate catastrophe. Ice covers large parts of the Earth, and life is struggling to survive. You're suiting up in a diving suit to explore the amazing Paleozoic creatures of the deep waters. Much of the Cambrian fauna of the previous period was long gone, and now, here in the Ordovician, you'll discover vicious sea scorpions, squids with shells curved like ram's horns, strange jawless fish, and oversized sea bugs. The largest and most impressive thing you're looking for is called Endoceras, a prehistoric animal with a shell so long that it's been measured longer than 3 people standing on top of each other. A glacial wind blows fine rain at you like tiny icy pellets, and your teeth chatter behind your oxygen mask. It is insanely cold out on the Paleotethys, and you need an air tank to breathe in the low oxygen of the Ordovician. Above you, it is overcast, and the waters are choppy and grey. The air smells salty and bracing. You look to the horizon and still see land. It's where you just sailed from, an ancient and gigantic supercontinent called Gondwana. To get an idea of how huge Gondwana is, it's made up of the modern-day land masses of South America, Africa, Madagascar, India, Antarctica, Australia, Zealandia, and Arabia, all stuck together. Inland, Gondwana is a flooded continent with vast inland seas, each one with thriving reef ecosystems evolving in beautifully isolated pockets. Elsewhere, beyond the horizon, there are smaller continents too. There's Siberia, Laurentia, and Baltica, pieces of land that are still around today in some form. Let's quickly rewind to 3 hours ago. You were exploring the beaches of Gondwana, which you still see as a thin sliver of land on the horizon. The shore was covered in the shells of trilobites, brachiopods, cephalopods, and crinoid stems, and without any animals on land to eat their remains, they just built up there. But the land was a lively place in other ways. There was a revolution in progress on the coastlines and rivers of planet Earth. The coastal areas were teeming with the very first plants carving out their niche on land. Sometime around 470 million years ago, around 25 million years before this cold and windy day on the research boat, plants had made their transition from single-celled marine organisms to multicellular land colonizers. They still required a habitat with high moisture to survive, so they mostly lived in places where the tides could keep them constantly wet. You explored these tiny coastal gardens, made mostly of mosses and liverworts. They shone bright green and glistened in the sun after each wave drenched them. They grew on rocks, creating the earliest ever soils. They are the most basic multicellular plants without true leaves, no roots, no seeds, and no vascular system like stems to transport water and nutrients. Instead, they used hair-like filaments called rhizoids to anchor against the ground. They evolved tough spore linings and cuticles to protect them from drying out, and it's thanks to these hard spores that we were able to see them in the fossil record in the first place. Now, back to the ship. You watch as an iceberg slowly rolls over, exposing an underside of electric blue. Ordovician Earth wasn't always in an ice age like this, which we call the Andean-Saharan Ice Age. In fact, most of this period was a hot and humid world of cozy, warm oceans and vibrant reefs, brimming with life, similar to the Cambrian. It wasn't until the very end of the Ordovician that the climate flipped into a 30 million year deep freeze. As the Ordovician climate fluctuated, so too did the level of the oceans. By the middle of the Ordovician, ocean levels, which were as high as they were in the Cambrian, plummeted, possibly as much as 200 meters lower than they used to be. To put that into perspective, that's a sea level drop higher than 2 Statue of Liberties. In the process, it exposed massive continental shelves and isolated inland seas. By the late Ordovician, the Earth's sea levels rose again and reached their highest extent, the highest water levels of the entire Paleozoic era. But by the very end of the Ordovician, the time you set sail to explore the oceans, Earth's temperatures dropped and locked up seawater as ice. Just below the waves, there's movement. Something massive is moving just beside the ship. There's a sinister silhouette with a wide body, spiked claws, and a segmented tail. It's a sea scorpion, an arthropod that is as long as a human is tall. It looks like Pentacopterus or maybe Megalograptus, but it's hard to be sure. It doesn't stay long and it dives down into the deep grey void. Let's go after it. You have your diving suit on and you are being lowered down from the ship, descending down to the seafloor through the deep blue expanse. It's not long until you reach the seafloor. Down here, there are columns of white tubes that reach up from the seafloor to create alien towers. They're sponge reefs, living animals that grow on top of each other. By the Ordovician, the last of the primitive sponges of the Cambrian, the horn-shaped Archaeocyathus sponges, had all gone extinct. What you're looking at here are demosponges, tall structures with soft bodies over a hard calcium carbonate skeleton. They're incredibly successful, and 90% of the sponges in the modern day are from this class. There are other large sessile animals here too, and they're the crinoids. They're elegant echinoderms with long stalks, feathering out into long, flowing filaments. Some crinoids in this ocean can grow to the size of small trees. Down below are creatures scuttling and crawling between these superstructures. You identify them right away. Trilobites. With their armoured, segmented bodies, crescent moon heads, and advanced compound eyes, these iconic arthropods dominated the Cambrian seas. By the Ordovician, they had learned some new survival tricks. New genera such as Amphix, a tiny trilobite the size of a coin, show collective behaviour, and you see them walking along the ocean floor in a conga line. Some of these trilobites have even been found fossilised in the middle of their walk. Other Ordovician trilobites were growing massive. The largest known trilobite was Isotellus rex from the Ordovician, which have been recorded at 72 centimeters in length, almost as big as a skateboard. To defend themselves, some Cambrian trilobites could literally fold themselves in half like a piece of paper to protect their bodies. In the Ordovician, some learned a new trick, rolling themselves up into a ball like pill bugs. Look up, overhead. Something is hovering above you, imposing and sinister. A long, thick object rises up vertically like a massive tree trunk, tapering to a point. It is a massive cone-shaped shell, and on the bottom end, a nest of tentacles drift idly a few meters from the ocean floor. It's a cephalopod called Endoceras. Look along the shell. Small brachiopod shells are attached along its length, waving in the current and hitching a ride. It's almost completely still, except when the ocean currents gently tip it off its axis. The largest confirmed fossil of Endoceras was 5.7 meters long, taller than 3 average height humans standing on top of each other. There are rumors of another fossil that was 9 meters long, but there is no record of it anymore. It was probably an apex predator that ate smaller animals, although some argue that it might have been a gentle filter feeder. You stare at the Endoceras, and its huge eye stares right back at you. Inside that colossal orthocone is the animal's digestive system, central nervous system, and circulatory system. It also contains gas-filled chambers called septa, linked with a tubular tissue called the siphuncle that controls its buoyancy. It's difficult to determine exactly how it lived because its soft parts didn't fossilize well, but we can guess some things based on its modern-day relatives. It is thought to have been an inactive and sluggish creature. When it needed to move, it probably used an organ called a siphon as a jet propulsion system. Today, cephalopods have good eyesight to make them formidable predators, but whether Endoceras had strong eyesight is still up for debate. Recent studies using 3D printed orthocone replicas have concluded that it must have lived almost entirely vertically. Based on the shape of the shell and the vertical arrangement of the chambers inside, it was probably very inefficient when it toppled sideways, and staying upright would have saved energy. The Ordovician was something of a gilded age for cephalopods, and they diversified into many new shapes and sizes. The straight cone-shaped shell, called an orthocone, is believed to have been one of the simplest and most inefficient shapes. One of Endoceras' close relatives was Endoceras, once believed to be a fellow giant, but now studies believe it was much smaller. Other cephalopods, which rose to prominence during the Ordovician, were experimenting with a range of other strange configurations. Certiconic shells like that of Endoceras were slightly curved like a bullhorn. Longicones were long and thin, and brevicones were short and wide. Some of the first coiled shells belonged to the order of the Tarphicerids. These shells were stronger, required less energy to move, and were probably more active and maneuverable. But there are many ways to make coils. Endoceras is one unique example, creating a loose coil that forms a spiral shape, while Tarphiceras coiled more tightly. A school of small armored fish swim past. They are jawless fish in a group called the ostracoderms, and there's nothing like them alive in the present day. These fish are called astrapsis, and they have a single fin at the end of a long, flexible tail that propels a large, bony head. As you watch them swim past, you notice their funny faces with a permanent look of surprise. They look like simple creatures, but they also have lots of sophisticated evolutionary adaptations that will one day make fish the masters of the ocean. Their tails shimmer with shining scales, and they have a hard armored plate enclosing their head. They have gills, but no body fins or movable jaws. That's right, jaws hadn't evolved yet. Instead of biting, ostracoderms feed by using their slit-shaped mouth to suck up prey like little vacuums. There are many other different groups of vertebrates that diversified in the Ordovician. One group was the conodonts, which first appeared in the late Cambrian. Conodonts were also jawless fish, not much longer than a toothbrush, with long, slender bodies like an eel, and they would flourish during the Ordovician. You see one slipping past along the seafloor, Pandarodus, with a mouth full of oversized teeth. Conodonts, which means cone tooth, are named for their distinctive spiked teeth-like elements, which are extremely abundant in the fossil record. While their fossilized teeth elements have been discovered all over the place since the 19th century, it wasn't until the 1980s that paleontologists found out what their body actually looked like. On the ocean floor, the Ordovician was a great time for diversification of invertebrates, such as the filter-feeding brachiopods. Brachiopods are a phylum of shelled animals, which use an organ called a lophophore to take in nutrients and oxygen with feathery tentacles. Brachiopods dominated during this period and lived freely on the ocean floor or anchored to rocks and reef structures. You start to notice things that look like branched twigs with little serrated edges. They're attached to the seafloor, and others float freely. Some are as long as your finger, others longer than your arm, and most form a V shape. They're called graptolites, and they're a major component of Ordovician reefs. Each one is a colony of invertebrate filter feeders that build and share a chitin skeleton. Like a little apartment block, individual graptolites live in their own compartments and use tentacles to snatch plankton from the water. In fact, graptolite fossils are so abundant in the Ordovician that they are used as index fossils to mark geologic boundaries. The English geologist Charles Lapworth used these graptolite fossils in northern Wales to define the Ordovician in 1879. You watch a graptolite drift down and become entangled in a crinoid. Crinoids are echinoderms, ancient cousins of starfish and sea urchins. In the Paleozoic oceans, they were commonly found attached to the seafloor in shallow water, with a long stem and branched feather-like arms to filter feed from the ocean. You look around and see hundreds of crinoids, many of which are several meters tall. While small crinoids called sea lilies still exist today, In the Ordovician, crinoids were formidable giants. Besides crinoids, echinoderms came in many other shapes and sizes in the Ordovician. You spot blastoids, which are echinoderms just a few millimeters in diameter. They look like flower buds, anchored to the seafloor with a flexible stem. This is also the time that the first sea stars and brittle stars appear on the ocean floor, as well as their now extinct cousins, their Edrioasteroids. Another newcomer to the tree of life are the first bryozoans. They are tiny filter feeders that snatch detritus from the sea with a lophophore, building together in huge colonies that create hard reef structures. They are the first and only new animal phylum to appear since the Cambrian. Look, another invertebrate. It's the shell of a Maclurites attached to the sponge cone, with a wonderful distinctive coil shape. The gastropods were another group that were thriving in the Ordovician, with the true snails and limpets first appearing. At the end of the Cambrian, many of the radiodont apex predators like the wheel-toothed Anomalocaris had gone extinct. Some of the surviving radiodonts shifted into a more passive lifestyle. One of these Ordovician radiodonts was a Ginkgo, an arthropod with a tough armored head, long segmented body lined with swimming flaps, and specially modified front appendages that were likely used to collect and eat plankton. A Ginkgo was an enormous arthropod with some fossilized specimens measuring up to 2 meters long. While the radiodonts shifted from apex hunters to gentle giants, new arthropod hunters with more advanced weaponry were taking their place. They were called the Eurypterids, also known as sea scorpions. They were arthropods with long segmented bodies, armored heads that featured powerful compound eyes, and a rear segment called a telson that was tipped with a large spike that later evolved to a strong tail paddle. Some of the evolutionary adaptations of the Eurypterids were their specialized appendages, which differed from genus to genus. Near the mouth were claw-like pincers. Along the side were large swimming paddles, and other legs for walking were alongside their bodies. Most were small creatures like Brachyopterus, which was about the size of your finger, but as they continued to dominate the seas, they would grow to colossal sizes, like the 1.7 meter long Pentacopterus. In the Ordovician, however, Eurypterids were still relative newcomers, and they would further diversify in the millions of years that followed. What really amazes you about this dive is just how different it is from the previous Cambrian period. Over the 45 million years of the Ordovician period, life under the sea went through an exciting adaptive radiation. This rapid diversification over about 30 million years is called the Ordovician radiation, and saw the animal phyla which were established during the Cambrian expand in diversity. And what caused it? Well, there might be an unusual cosmic explanation. About 470 million years ago, 2 colossal asteroids smashed themselves to pieces somewhere between Mars and Jupiter. The inner solar system, including Earth, was showered with debris like asteroids and meteors. They hit our planet 100 times more frequently than usual. It's called the Ordovician meteor event. But how does this tie into evolution? Well, as large asteroids smashed into the Earth and essentially erased whole ecosystems, the idea is that when local life recovered, they adapted into all kinds of new forms. Around 445 million years ago, the time you're currently diving in, Earth began to shift into a new ice age. It is called the Hernantian glaciation, and as it covered the continents with ice, sea levels dropped significantly. Temperatures plummeted, and the supply of oxygen to the ocean depths was choked off. But after just a few million years like this, just as the survivors were adapting to the cold and populations recovered, the ice age abruptly ended. The ice melted, ocean levels rose, and the Earth warmed dramatically. The effect of this up and down temperature change on living things was profound, and many species could not adapt and went extinct. We call this the Late Ordovician extinction event, the first major mass extinction of the Phanerozoic. A mass extinction sounds dramatic, What exactly is a mass extinction? As the Earth is constantly changing, species go extinct all the time as they struggle to adapt to new environments, or are outcompeted in their niches. And just as it's natural for species to evolve, it's natural to eventually go extinct. But sometimes, because of different factors, many species go extinct all at once. When more than about 75% of all species go extinct during a relatively short window, about 2.8 million years, we call this a mass extinction. There have been 5 particularly apocalyptic mass extinctions in our current eon, and the end Ordovician mass extinction was the first. It was also one of the most catastrophic of all time, and around 85% of all species on Earth were lost. But how could such a destructive ice age just happen? The leading theory goes that the plants and fungi that were growing on the land were involved, and they started a chain reaction of chemical changes that changed the climate. When plants and fungi grew on coastal rocks, they broke them down through natural processes. Over millions of years, minerals from these rocks and elements like phosphorus leached into the oceans, which encouraged huge blooms of algae in the surrounding seas. When those algae then died, bacteria broke them down using oxygen in the process, which depleted oxygen in the oceans. Now, large parts of the oceans were deprived of dissolved oxygen. Carbon was unable to form carbon dioxide, and instead it was locked away in the seafloor, forming layers of black shale rock. That black shale was a clue. When geologists find rare black shale, especially on a global scale, it's a sign that something was seriously wrong with the oceans at that time. And because carbon dioxide traps heat, a drop in CO2 causes a drop in temperature. As those plants and fungi repeated this cycle without any counterbalance to stop them, for tens of millions of years, the result was cooling across the Earth. The sea temperatures plummeted, the water froze, and the oceans dropped. Entire inland seas on Gondwana froze or dried up, killing off many of the unique species living in them. Meanwhile, the deepest ocean floors became anoxic zones, which was terrible news for animals living there. Compounding this was tectonic activity and volcanic eruptions leaking poisonous gases into the atmosphere. The effect of these conditions on life was extreme. Small animals anchored to the seafloor didn't stand a chance, as their warm, oxygen-rich homes froze and became anoxic. Over 100 animal families were made extinct and disappeared forever. The shelled creatures were badly affected, especially brachiopods, bryozoans, trilobites, cephalopods, and many conodont families. As you watch the patch of giant crinoids waving gently in the current, a bloom of jellies crowds the waters above. You look up, and the jellies illuminate against the electric blue icebergs that creak and moan as they scrape together. A conodont slithers gracefully through an opening of a deep-sea sponge bioherm, and as it passes, a tiny cluster of spiral snails retract into their shells. You spot the empty shell of a Endoceras on the seafloor, as long as your finger, and glimmering with iridescent sheen. You pick it up. It's a curious souvenir, a symbol of the incredible evolution of the Ordovician. Looking up, you see the Endoceras has changed posture, and it fans out its tentacles into a wide arc. Its vertically buoyant shell is now tilted diagonally, near to horizontal. Its eyes have fixed on something. In a rush, the orthocone unleashes its ambush on an unsuspecting Astrapsis, and it forces its tentacles around the armored fish, moving it to its mouth. With a crunch, the armored fish shatters under the force of the cephalopod's beak. It sucks in the remains, scattering pieces of drifting detritus where the fish once was. It moves upright again, and with a pulse, it jets upward. The clock was ticking on many of these Ordovician animals, but for some, their descendants would live on as they thrived in the warm waters and brave new terrestrial worlds of the Silurian. If you're interested in learning about the worlds of deep time, make sure to like and subscribe.